Hey everybody, I'm Ed Wasson, I'm Rebel Intel, and in this video I'm going to try to provide you with at least like a very fast, brief 40,000 foot overview of about the last 40 years of American diplomacy and foreign policy or foreign affairs as it relates to the current situation with Trump tariffs and the interdictions in the Southern Caribbean and the recent Israeli strike in Qatar. So if you like this video, please consider supporting my channel by giving me a follow, like, share it, make a comment, ask me a question, have at it, and here we go. First, we're going to talk about these F-35s. Some F-35s just got redeployed to Puerto Rico by US President Donald Trump because shortly after Trump authorized the military strike on that alleged Venezuelan drug boat, President Maduro in Venezuela decided to flex and try to come close to buzzing some of the US naval vessels with a jet, reportedly an F-16. So Trump warned him, and Trump sent some F-35s to the region in an area where they could probably strike Venezuela pretty easily. Now the first thing we're going to look at is going back to the mid to early 80s with President Ronald Reagan. President Ronald Reagan authorized Operation Diablo Canyon, which was our F-111 Aardvark airstrike in Libya. Basically, through this Crypto AG program that I have a post on, which was the Swiss company that was owned by the CIA, it's now supposedly reported and known that that is how US intelligence got its information that Gaddafi had a hand in some terrorist attacks that targeted service members of the United States in Europe, especially Italy. From there we go to Operation Urgent Fury, the invasion by the US of Grenada. The US invaded another sovereign state, Grenada, in the Southern Caribbean, and some scholars and historians, international relations and historical scholars, argue that this was a necessity, and some of them argue that this was a wag the dog distraction because recall about 48 hours earlier the US Marine barracks and embassy got hit by Hezbollah in Beirut, Lebanon. Unfortunately, that wasn't the end of President Reagan's troubles in the Middle East, as CIA station chief in Beirut, Lebanon, William Buckley, also got kidnapped there by Hezbollah, and they tortured him egregiously and severely for over a year before sending his dead corpse back home. And unfortunately, at the end of Reagan's era, Reagan also had to deal with the emergence of, or the revelation of, the Iran-Contra affair, which he says that he didn't have any knowledge of. Now fast forward real quick to Damascus 2008, a joint CIA-Mossad operation got Hezbollah commander Imad Mughniyeh. We go back in time again to the late 80s, 1989, and then President George H.W. Bush, Bush 41, authorized Operation Just Cause, the U.S. military operation of Panama, another sovereign state that we invaded. Why? Because we said the Panamanian president, President Manuel Noriega, was a dictator and a drug dealer, although we also had to eventually admit that he was a former CIA asset. So essentially, the United States was basically setting its own house in order. I have some slides here of the action in Panama there. There's the news event, United States invades Panama December 20th, 1989. Eventually, there would emerge this thing in the United States called the Powell Doctrine. I have a whole paper on that discusses all of the ins and outs of Operation Just Cause as a strategic and political analysis that looks at the Powell Doctrine and how the U.S. justifies these types of actions. And the U.S. typically is not taken into an international criminal or international court of justice type scenario where they have to pay any reparations, although they have in some cases in the past. Now we fast forward to Bill Clinton's era, post-Desert Shield, post-Desert Storm. We knew, by the way, that the Soviet Union was going to basically dissolve. And in 1991, when it did, that provided the Clinton era with what they called the peace dividend. And Clinton was able to essentially draw back a little bit from the CIA and Department of Defense budgets. He also closed down a few forward operating bases, or FOBs. Now, some in intelligence and military, they blame this era under Clinton for what would be the rise of hybrid threats like Al-Qaeda. Well, 1998, Clinton had an opportunity to strike in Khartoum, Sudan, but ended up striking Al-Shifa Pharmaceutical, supposedly, and missing bin Laden. And he also struck the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. Were these collateral errors, or was it something similar to what Trump has recently done with the Venezuelan drug boat, and it's actually a signal to these hybrid threats or China? At the end of the Clinton years, Clinton had to deal with these scandals. You know, it started with him saying ridiculous things like, "I didn't inhale," and it ended with him saying things like, "I had no relations with that woman." The end of Bush 41 was partially because at the end of his term, although we were coming off of a high from Operation Just Cause and Desert Storm, and President Bush was at that time one of the most popular presidents in history, he sank to all-time lows when he said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." At the same time, Clinton was playing the saxophone on Arsenio Hall. So that's basically what happened there. We go into 2003. There was actually a rapprochement with Libya. Gaddafi actually agreed to partially align with the United States and disarm. So after all of that time, after the initial strikes by the U.S. in Libya, eventually 2003, there was this rapprochement, but that didn't last long. Eventually also in 2003, President Bush 43 said Saddam Hussein has WMDs and is linked to Al-Qaeda. We know what happened there and who benefited. These military contractors and suppliers with hundreds of thousands of troops deploying in and out, and they were getting thousands and thousands of dollars of kit, and quite often refitted and resupplied. I got a new pair of boots every 4 months or so that I was downrange, and also everybody got at least 5 anthrax shots. So that's who benefited out of that. NATO did not join that, by the way. NATO joined us in Afghanistan due to Article 5, but not Iraq. Flip back to 1988, we had the USS Vincennes accidentally shoot down Iranian 655 that was coming from Bandar Abbas to Dubai. Now, the rumit back in the day, when I got back in the military in 2008, was that they had intelligence that some IRGC members were on that. It doesn't even matter. This is one of those cases where the U.S. didn't even allow it to go to the International Court of Justice. The U.S. paid the families of those victims millions and millions of dollars. We go, real quick plug for my paper in my Substack. I've got a paper on Zing, which is a social media app, and I tell you everything about it and how it's a commodity in the international political economy, and how it's going to be like TikTok, but it's a theoretical social media platform that will also have a verified adult side, not just for OnlyFans exclusive content type adult material, but for any of those content creators that want to avoid those crazy opaque restrictions and bans and such from like Instagram and TikTok. Also have a full report, as I mentioned previously, on Operation Just Cause in Panama, and that is from a politics and war and strategy and analysis perspective. So please go to my Substack and you'll find those. Now we fast forward to the Obama years, when by this time they were seeing that Gaddafi was emerging as a threat again in the Arab Spring, and they were saying he was basically using too much force to put down his people. And Obama and Hillary Clinton, they basically courted the United Nations to pass UN Resolution 1973 to authorize NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is there to basically protect Western Europe from the Soviet Union, which no longer exists. They're there to protect Western Europe from Soviet Union invasion in Europe with those member states that are in the European Union. However, Hillary Clinton and Obama convinced the UN to allow NATO to conduct offensive military strikes in Libya specifically for decapitation, regime change, because we had had it with Gaddafi. Under Obama, we also expanded the drone wars, and we actually struck 2 American citizens intentionally in Yemen, essentially an assassination strike, and there's no transparency to it. That's the one thing that disappoints me. I'm okay with the strike overall because I was in intelligence at that time and I knew who Anwar al-Awlaki was and all about him. So I knew he was a threat, but I'm not okay with the lack of transparency because there has to be some way that they can declassify some of that information, get it to the people, and let the people know this is what we had on Anwar al-Awlaki that justified this strike. But we haven't seen it yet, and I doubt that we ever will. Then we go to 2020 in an episode called The Bay of Piglets, in which back in 2020, a former supposedly U.S. Special Forces guy got a ragtag band of freedom fighters and actually tried to do an invasion of Venezuela back then. And it got thwarted by Maduro's thugs, or if you want to call them thugs. There's a picture here, Bay of Piglets, a bizarre plot to capture a president. They tried to capture Maduro back then. He probably had a reward for him back then. Recall that recently, in 2024, President Biden put, I believe it was a $25 million reward for the capture of Maduro. President Trump has even more recently bumped that up to $50 million. That brings us to the question, was it a drug boat? Now, there's a lot of material that I cover here real quick, but this article from Forbes covers a variety of different watercraft, from a Caribbean Yola to the Go-Slows to the GFVs or Go Fast vehicles. You see a few pictures of them and then a diagram of them and how they look. And essentially, not only did it look very much like a Go Fast vehicle hauling drugs, but because of our persistent intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance, we are no longer in the days where the U.S. can claim, like back in Clinton's days, oops, I struck the Chinese embassy in Belgrade and El Shifa Pharmaceutical in Khartoum on accident. We have too much ISR out there. They were probably watching this boat load up, and they probably have high enough resolution and detailed video of the personnel boarding it to have positively identified most of them. In addition to that, we know that the Coast Guard and the Joint Interagency Task Force, or GIDF down there, are making record seizures of everything from precursors to actual product to human smuggling type operations. The typical human smuggling load is 20 to 50 packed in like sardines, and that wasn't this Venezuelan boat that got struck. Also, there's news in social media coming out recently about the indictment of a man that got charged previously in Brazil who was caught flying a helicopter loaded with almost 500 kilograms of product. Now, if you look that up, you're going to find that's actually happened multiple times just in Brazil alone. Some of that is actually connected to TDA or Tren de Aragua as well. That brings us to the geopolitics and high bids and U.S. pressure cloud COSCO's global port ambitions. Basically, what we're seeing emerge with this great power competition is China's trying to flex its influence on the ports that it has control over throughout most of Latin America and the Panama Canal, and the U.S. is clearly trying to do that throughout the region with the deployment of those troops in this region as well. So Trump's shot on that Venezuelan boat was not just a shot at Maduro, it was a signal heard loud and clear in China. And by the way, Maduro wasn't able to attend that Chinese military pride parade of their, commemorating their 80th, year of victory, which is kind of odd. I guess the Chinese believe that they won World War II. On our side, anyway, we're telling our history students that basically if it wasn't for the US and United Kingdom, China would still be speaking Japanese. We certainly know that it wasn't China that dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan. Now this brings us to some recent events such as the violence that we're seeing in America and elsewhere with the stabbing of that 23-year-old Ukrainian migrant in Charlotte last month. Actually, this occurred some time ago. However, it's not just there. Last year, Vincent Lee actually beheaded somebody on a bus in Canada. And they didn't even charge him criminally. They put him in a mental institution for annual review. He could get out any day if his annual mental review is more positive. So here's a dude that basically got away with cutting somebody's head off, and that's not isolated to those incidents either. We've been tracking incidents like this since well before 2008, where numerous incidents occurred in Germany, Italy, Spain, and Great Britain. And somebody just jumps up on a bus in Germany with a knife and starts shouting Allahu Akbar and starts stabbing people, and the German media essentially suppressed those types of stories. So keep looking for violence to potentially increase, but this is part of Trump's reason for, and Trump is not alone in this. It's not a Trump and Republican thing. You'll see Democratic governors like Gavin Newsom and Michelle Lujan, whatever her last name is, in New Mexico, actually activating their guard to clean up crime and homelessness in those states. So why Trump is getting like the only stink finger and stink eye pointed at him, I'm not quite sure. But this brings us up to country updates. I've got a few country updates. Haiti, Gaza, Ukraine, and Democratic Republic of Congo. These reports come from Crisis Group. Let's go to Haiti. The U.S. and Panama circulated a draft resolution at the UN Security Council that proposes to transform the Kenya-led Multinational Security Support Mission, or MSS, deployed in Haiti to combat spiraling gang violence, but it's currently hampered by understaffing and underfunding. They're trying to transition it into a new gang suppression force. The new force would consist of 5,500 uniformed personnel and 50 civilian staff, backstopped by a new UN support office in Port-au-Prince for logistics. It would also carry a broader mandate than the MSS currently, notably the freedom to conduct counter-gang operations independent of the Haitian police. Now, Crisis Group expert Daniel Forti notes Washington's heightened focus on Haiti is welcome, but other council members will ask tough questions about the proposed mission's leadership, funding, troop contributions, and coordinated mechanisms. I'll also add they need to have the political will, because they're going to shift ostensibly through this plan from basic peacekeeping and observation and security support into what would essentially become proactive or offensive law enforcement that's going to end up being raids to try to tackle the gang issue out there through this gang suppression force. Going to Ukraine, leaders of the Coalition of the Willing, an ad hoc group of 35 primarily European backers of Kyiv, met in Paris Thursday to work out security guarantees for Ukraine in the event of a ceasefire with Russia. French President Emmanuel Macron said 26 countries have committed support for a reassurance force to deploy once a ceasefire is agreed, and that the shape of U.S. involvement would be finalized in the coming days. So it's interesting that they're reporting that President Macron is telling us when the U.S. is going to finalize their involvement. But Crisis Group expert who wrote this, Lucien Kim, says that the pledges mark an important signal of continued Western support for Ukraine, though it's difficult to imagine Washington making a firm commitment given President Trump's shifting stance towards Kyiv. The plan also remains contingent on a ceasefire, which Moscow shows little sign of accepting as it presses battlefield advances and strikes against Ukrainian cities. Moving on to Palestine, This is just a quick blurb. This op-ed, they say Israel's Gaza campaign has entered an even more nightmarish phase. The world must press Israel harder to stop the war regardless of day after questions, lest its offensive destroy Palestinian life in the Strip beyond hope and recovery. This is after Israel struck Hamas in Qatar. And this was, although news is saying that Netanyahu has said this was a unilateral act by Israel, President Trump in the White House almost certainly had advanced knowledge of it. Whether they gave it the green light like Israeli media says or not is yet to be seen, but it's hard to imagine Israel making a move like this with no knowledge whatsoever by the White House. I've said it before, I'll say it again, Israel is in an all-in situation. They need to continue pressing the fight, and Netanyahu needs this to continue in order for him to continue shoring up control domestically. At the end of the day, Trump also warned Hamas, this is your last chance. Therefore, President Trump likely knew about this strike. It's interesting because this strike occurs as we're going into Democratic Republic of Congo news now. During a second meeting of the Joint Oversight Committee in Washington on Wednesday, Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo reaffirmed their commitment to the June 27 peace agreement while acknowledging that progress has been limited. Kigali and Kinshasa, that's the capitals of Rwanda and DRC, they also agreed to establish military and intelligence channels for information exchange. Meanwhile, clashes continued, particularly around the town of Uvira in South Kivu, even as talks between the M23 and the DRC resumed. Guess where? Where? In Doha, under Qatari mediation. By the way, it's interesting that Doha is a mediator for all of these things, whereas they have a hand to play in some of it to begin with, because intelligence has accused Qatar of financing and facilitating terrorist groups, and Qatar and Saudi Arabia have a stake in the African region. Both sides traded accusations of ceasefire violations and missed an August 18 deadline for a formal agreement. Again, crisis group expert Onesphore Sematuba, if I'm saying the person's name correctly, says the parties' continued engagement is encouraging, but real time-bound progress is needed to prevent the effort from unraveling. Otherwise, there is a risk of a return to full-scale war, which would further worsen an already disastrous situation for populations trapped in a sprawling conflict. I've posted about this previously. In the area, I think just outside of Kinshasa, they have a refugee area of about 2 million people. So there's your wrap-up of world events and how they basically align with, you have a better, clear picture of the overall global situation. At the end of the day, in America, we are not seeing isolationism, but a pivot towards protectionism and neo-mercantilism. The U.S. is shoring up control domestically and setting our house in order and firing warning shots at those who are obviously have a hand in providing substances to our communities inside America to destroy America from within. Whether anybody thinks or believes that that is justification for offensive military strikes or not is irrelevant. Under the Powell Doctrine, whether it's real or manipulated, the U.S. is going to conduct these types of strikes. So expect to see offensive military strikes inside Venezuela authorized by Trump in the coming days.